Pia Orrenius, our senior fellow, thank you so much for having this conversation with us today. And well, thank you for all your research and being our senior fellow. We're really grateful for that. And we're really excited to talk to you about immigration today. There's so much already being talked about and happening. And we were hoping you can give us an overview about the latest immigration trends right now. So to start us right off, can you catch us up on the recent trends in immigration, particularly as they concern US-Mexico migration and the Southwest border?
Sure, Jenny. Yeah, thanks for having me. Uh, so we have seen really very interesting changes along the border in the last 10, 15 years or so. Because if you look back to really the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, we just saw consistently increasing undocumented immigration along the US-Mexico border, and most of that was from Mexico. And then, interestingly, in the 2000s, that type of migration peaked and began to decline. And it particularly declined precipitously in the Great Recession. And interestingly, it never came back. So undocumented immigration from Mexico, in particular of Mexicans, never really recovered after the Great Recession. So it really returned to sort of, if you look at the apprehensions of, Border Patrol apprehensions of migrants, which is sort of our only real-time measure that we have of undocumented immigration, you see that it drops really to what we consider historic lows in the years really since 2010. And demographers have actually done estimates of not just gross in migration from Mexico of Mexicans, but also net migration. And they show that net migration actually in some of the years following the recession were actually either zero, close to zero, or slightly negative. So a big reversal there in the trends we've seen before. Then what happened though is that after a few years, maybe around 2014, 2015, we begin to see an increase, not in immigration of Mexicans, but in immigration of Central Americans. And the interesting thing about the Central American migration in recent years has been it's not really your traditional undocumented immigration. What Central Americans are doing increasingly, because they face such adverse consequences in their home countries, is they're seeking asylum. So they'll actually come to the US-Mexico border, and instead of trying to cross what we call, illegal entry, they will actually turn themselves into the Border Patrol and ask for asylum. And in I believe it was 2018, 2019, we saw a particularly large spike of this type of migration. And then I'm sure many of you are familiar with some of the responses, especially in the US administration, to this particular spike in asylum seekers from Central America.
I'm going to stay on the topic of asylum, especially from Central America, because recently we've had changes in the system here in the US. And regarding these changes to the asylum seeking process in the US, what would have to happen or what steps would be needed in order to modify what's currently in place? I think I'm referring mostly to people waiting on the Mexican side of the border now versus what the way the process used to be before,
Right.
among other
So
changes.
yeah, there's been a lot of changes in one direction and now in another direction. So let me take you back. So when initially, when the Trump administration in particular was confronted with this very, very large spike of asylum seekers from Central America, they took a number of measures to try to address this migration and deter this migration. Some of these measures have been very publicized in the media and have been extremely controversial. Things like separating children from their parents, for example, or the migration protection protocol, which we also call Remain in Mexico, which actually forced asylum seekers from Central America to wait in Mexico as their claims were processed. But actually, the most effective policy was neither of those. Effective in the way of, and I mean effective in stopping, stopping this surge. The most effective measure was really working with the government of Mexico to address transit migration. So this really hasn't been talked about as much, but it was really, I think, much thanks to the government of Mexico that cracked down on their borders with Central America, with Guatemala in particular, that cut off the surges in migration that we were seeing, a couple of years ago. And so that was really the number one piece of the puzzle. And then these other more, draconian measures followed. And of course, those probably helped deter further migration from these countries, and also, frankly, from other countries as well. Now, under the current administration, we are seeing that the desire is to roll back some of these restrictions and really to comply more with, I guess, what a lot of people interpret as the humanitarian obligations of the United States. I mean, we have humanitarian obligations under international treaties. We have obligations to our neighbors as well to process, some of these migrants. And so the current administration is trying to roll back some of the changes that were implemented that we talked about, remain in Mexico. Certainly the separation of children from parents has been ended, prior, but it's still going to be difficult. It's going to be very hard because at the end of the day, more people want to come here than we can accommodate with our resources that we have currently. So we can definitely do a better job, but whoever it is that's in charge is going to be struggling always to balance, doing the right thing with doing what we can with the resources we have, and then realizing certainly we can't take in everybody. So it's a delicate balance.
Speaking of delicate balances and just trying to find the best way to implement policies, do you think, again, speaking of asylum, regarding the Remain in Mexico policy as it's become known, do you think that has actually, or has that been one of the measures that has actually helped our system? Or did that only add more burden to Mexico's system, for example, without really having an impact on our own? What are your perspectives on this?
I think what Remain in Mexico or the migration protection protocols, I think probably it had a number of effects. I mean, for the people that persevered in the process and decided to go along with it, and actually decided to remain in Mexico along the border and wait for their claims to be processed, I think for them, it's been very difficult because of the adverse conditions in which they're living in Mexico, the fact that they're very vulnerable to gangs and human traffickers and other criminal elements, if you will. And of course, so it's been very difficult for those families. I think what you've also seen, though, is because it's such a draconian measure, a lot of people probably returned home and gave up on asylum seeking. Some may have entered illegally and just bypassed trying to seek asylum. That's also a possibility. In terms of the pressure on Mexico, I think a lot of those asylum seekers did not and have not sought asylum in Mexico. I think the pressure on Mexico is more generalized as Mexico has become a transit country for migrants. That's a very different place than they were in before. We started out talking about how, most of the undocumented immigration and a lot of legal migration has been traditionally from Mexico to the United States. And we still have a lot of legal immigration from Mexico to the United States, but it really has not persevered. It's really not such a large source of undocumented immigration that it was. And so now, instead of being sort of a source country for migrants, Mexico has become a transit country for migration. And so it's in a very different spot. And it has, it's facing very unique challenges. And again, vis-a-vis its neighbors in Central America, vis-a-vis the United States, and they're trying to figure out, how to manage this flow, how to control the flow, and at the same time, keeping up with their neighbors.
We're going to go to neighbors and something you already mentioned, which was a new administration and new policies. What would be the impact of a large-scale legalization program such as the one proposed by President Biden, and what would it mean for migration along the U.S.-Mexico border?
So, I've written several papers on this, looking at the impacts of legalization of undocumented immigrants. And there are a number of benefits to legalization, in particular for the immigrants that receive legal status, obviously, and their families. So once they have legal status, they can work legally, they can pay taxes, they can get driver's licenses, they can, get bank accounts and get mortgages and buy cars. And so there's benefits there for them. There's benefits for the US economy by integrating these individuals. There's benefits for the labor market in the sense that we really do need employers to be employing workers that are authorized to work in the United States. It's very important. So again, a number of benefits. There's also a lot of research showing how legalization benefits children of undocumented parents. And so these children have better outcomes in school. They get better jobs. They have better mental health. I mean, there's a whole series of knock-on effects, and they're all quite beneficial. Now, there's no such thing as, a free lunch, as economists like to say, or we always focus on benefits and costs. And of course, with regard to the benefits of legalization, some of the costs, or one of the consequences, can be that it attracts more immigration. So in the past, most legalization programs, like the Immigration Reform and Control Act in 1986, that legalized over 2.5 million undocumented immigrants, IRCA. So what was IRCA's effect on the flow of undocumented immigration? Well, initially, the legalization program resulted in a decline in undocumented immigration. We looked at this when we were studying this. We looked at this again for the US-Mexico case, and we saw a decline, but it was temporary. And so after this transitory effect was over, we saw that illegal immigration flows returned to their trend within a couple of years of the legalization program. So despite the fact that you legalized 2.7 million undocumented immigrants, you still returned to trend. So that meant that many more were coming. So the lesson from that is that you have to, when you do a legalization program, the lesson that we can take away from that is that you have to combine it with border enforcement. You probably also want to combine it with legal worker programs. So if you think that undocumented immigrants and even asylum seekers to a certain extent are coming in to work in the US labor market because there are jobs for them, then the one way to address that is to allow for more foreign worker visas. So we could extend more visas to Mexico. We could extend more visas to Central America. We could bring in workers legally and not illegally. So I guess at the end of the day, legalization really should be part and parcel of a large comprehensive immigration reform, where you are addressing, or we are addressing, if you will, all the elements, all the knock-on effects that come with a large legalization. And I think that would be the best approach.
And just to close the conversation, any other thoughts about your migration outlook for the US and Mexico in the near future?
So I think that the outlook is probably for more of the same that we've seen in recent years, in terms of more pressure really from Central America, just because conditions there have not improved yet to the point where those conditions are still giving rise to more migration to the United States. So also, I don't think that we're going to see a resurgence of migration from Mexico because the decline in migration from Mexico, especially undocumented immigration from Mexico, is very related to demographic factors in Mexico. So if you look at that, usually it's pretty young people that migrate. So we look at, for example, the size of the cohort of people, the number of people, for example, between the ages of 18 and 24, or even 18 and 30. So the size of that cohort has peaked in Mexico and is beginning to decline. So their population is still growing, but this very important young sector of really workers joining the labor force, that push factor is diminishing in intensity because that cohort is beginning to shrink. As that happens, we are unlikely, even if we have a booming economy in the United States, after the pandemic is over, we're unlikely to see a resurgence in migration from Mexico. So I think in terms of the migration outlook, I think we'll continue to see the pressures coming from Central America and other countries in the world, maybe Latin America, Venezuela, places like that. But not really a resumption of the mass migration that we saw from Mexico, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So in the near term future, my guess is more of the same.
Thank you, Pia, for this very insightful conversation, and we look forward to talking to you again soon about migration.
Thank you, Jenny.